Welcome everyone to the ESCoE Economic Measurement webinar. I am Charlotte Min. I am a research associate at ESCoE and will be chairing this webinar. Today we are honored to have Professor Andrew Clark to present his work, COVID-19 Lockdowns and Wellbeing, Evidence from Google Trends. Andrew is a professor at the Paris School of Economics. His research focuses on labor economics, subjective well-being, and behavioral economics. He has published extensively at top peer-reviewed economic journals. Many of his papers are highly cited. This presentation will be around 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session for about 20 minutes. If you have any questions, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom at any time. We'll take questions after the presentation. Please also note that this webinar will be recorded and the video will be on the ESCoE website. Now, without any further ado, I will hand over to Andrew. Andrew, if you please unmute yourself and
Hello. I assume that this is working. Charlotte, if you could confirm.
Yes, it's working.
Thanks
perfectly.
very much. Okay, great. So thanks for the invitation. I'm a Londoner, so it's always nice to be back virtually. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is a paper that considers the effect of policy. And the context is COVID. The policy we're thinking about is lockdown, and the kind of effect that we're interested in is that on individual well-being. This is joint work with Nick Pautervy, Abel Brodeur, and Sarah Flesch. So we need information on well-being to do this paper, of course, but also in general. And there is a movement that some of you may be aware of towards making well-being the metric by which government policies should be evaluated and by which progress is measured, with the underlying argument being that well-being, if we can measure it correctly, is the only metric which is not instrumental. All other things are instrumental. We want income for a reason. We want health for a reason. We want education for a third reason. But we can't really answer the question, why do I want well-being? It's sort of the ultimate end, and that's what I mean by not instrumental. And if we can measure well-being and then see how these well-being scores are related to the domains of interest, then we can do policy, and policy is all about cost-benefit analysis, and for that we need to know the size of the benefits, how much these things matter when we're deciding between income and health, or transport versus education, or what have you. Now, especially in the current context of COVID, traditional surveys have not been particularly helpful for probably two reasons. One of which is they're just not very high frequency, and we can't wait until the 2020 ESCoE or 2021 Understanding Society survey has been in the field and then been cleaned and then released. We can't wait for that in order to make policy decisions that are very timely. We need to make them now. We can't wait 18 months. Having said that, many of the big surveys have been supplemented with a COVID wave or a number of COVID waves, but we're still not in any kind of real-time measurement of sentiment or well-being as we are in the Gallup survey, which runs almost every day in the US. So that's one drawback. is just the frequency of information. A second drawback is response rates. Response rates to face-to-face surveys and now to telephone surveys have been falling for quite some time. This gives you a picture about response rates since 2000 in a number of North American and UK surveys. The CPS does pretty well, but has lost 10 percentage points over the past 20 years. The LFS in the UK, and some of you may know this, is moving towards fairly disastrous response rate, going down towards 40% and has lost 25 percentage points since 2000. Now, of course, we don't care about that if non-response is random. If 2 out of every 5 people say, I'm just not going to do that, and they're random people, then fine, we lose a little bit of power perhaps, but we won't have biased estimates. The worry is that this non-response is not random. So we may need complementary types of data here, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to appeal to the power and prevalence of the internet that will allow us to measure sentiment in real time using large numbers of observations. I'm not suggesting this is a panacea, by the way, and we'll come back to that, but it is a useful approach to the question. So the context, as I say, is COVID, and the debate about public policy was essentially one about social welfare. What would a policy response do to the different things that enter social welfare? And the big argument in the press, at least, was between economic activity and mortality and morbidity. But there are many, many more things that we want to add in to this equation in order to carry out a real cost-benefit analysis, as we suggested in a paper with Richard Layard last year now. We include pollution, crime, and things of this nature. And pollution we can measure, crime we can measure, trust in the government's a little bit more difficult to measure frequently. But what is more difficult to measure in a high frequency way is mental health. So we wanted to know how mental health was affected by lockdown. And to do that, we're going to use the power of the internet, and we're going to use the Google search bar to try to figure out what has been happening to mental health. We're going to use something called Google Trends data, which just shows the volume of searches using Google. And this has been used in the literature. We're absolutely not the first to use this to relate the types of searches people make to various observable behaviors afterwards. And we're going to use this to measure mental health, as I say. And we're going to do it in a difference in difference way, and economists love differences in differences. Actually, social scientists like difference in differences. So we're going to be looking at internet searches to do with well-being, and I'll tell you exactly what that is in a second. And we're going to see how those internet searches changed pre-lockdown to post-lockdown in 2020. That's the first difference. And then we're going to compare that difference to the same difference 1 year earlier using the same placebo lockdown date, if you like. So UK was what, March 28th, I think, wasn't it? Something like that. March 24th. It's March 24th, 2020. So we're going to be looking at January 1st, March 23rd, 2020 versus March 24th to April 10th, 2020, compared to the gap in the same, exactly the same dates in 2019, just to pick up any seasonal changes to do with Easter or bad weather or whatever that goes on in people's search activity. Okay, and we submitted a pre-analysis plan of what exactly we wanted to do before we got any of the data. Now, what you get out of Google Trends when you make a submission to them, you ask for this data, is you get a relative number from 0 to 100. This is restricted in 3 ways. It's restricted by topic, it's restricted by a time period, and it's restricted by a geographical area. So we, for example, asked about divorce in the UK between January the 1st to January the 1st to April the 10th in 2020, for example. And the number that it gives you is the relative volume of searches that day, so say January the 15th, relative to the largest number of searches in any day in that period, in that geographical area. So the big divorce search date in the UK would have a value of 100, and all the other days would have a value relative to 100 and below 100, of course, right down from 0, which is sort of no meaningful flow. Okay, so that's what we've got. There's 2 ways of submitting these requests. You can either do a search term, which is an exact match on a word, or you can submit a topic query that uses all related search terms and groups them into a sort of thing that's related to boredom, that's related to irritability, related to worry, these kinds of things. And I don't know quite what the algorithm they use to do that is, but we submitted topic queries in the following 13 areas that you can see there, the 13 topic search terms. And our idea was to get something that looked a little bit like the 12 questions in the GHQ 12, if you're aware of that. It's a widely used psychometric tool. Okay, so far so easy, right? You submit the search terms, you get back your numbers, except it's not always quite so easy. If you ask for daily data, Google will provide that for a period of up to 9 months. If you ask for a period over 9 months, it will only provide you with weekly data. And the idea behind our difference in difference, of course, is that we compare 2020 to 2019. And as you can see, that is more than 9 months apart. So for the daily data, which is really what we want here to follow sentiment from day to day, we have 2 series, one from 2019 and one from 2020. And the drawback is these are not comparable series because their denominator is different. The scaling factors are not the same. So a figure of 40 in one year could correspond to something completely different to a figure of 40 in another year. But we survived, we managed. What we needed to do here was to take this daily data from the 2 years and then rescale it using the weekly data, which is a continuous series. So just a little bit of faffing around like that meant that we could reconstruct a comparable series, January to April 10th, in the 2 years. You may be wondering why April the 10th. I think it's because we put in the data request on April the 11th. That's why. There's nothing particularly spectacular about the 10th of April. Okay. So we collected the search data for all countries that had a full lockdown by the end of the period we were considering. And we end up with data on 9 European countries and the US at the state level, which you can do as well. Afterwards, when we were doing the analysis and writing the paper, I said, well, why don't we have Scandinavia? Because that would have been such an interesting comparison with the lighter touch, especially that Sweden took, relative to relative to the other Scandinavian countries and relative to the countries we're looking at here. And the answer is we forgot to put it in the pre-analysis plan, and since it wasn't in the PAP and we were being a little careful about that, we just didn't get data for Sweden. So there we are. That was an error, something we forgot to do. Right, now the reason that this works is that lockdowns in different countries and lockdowns in different states in the US did not happen at the same time. And these are the dates of the announcement of the lockdown and the effective full lockdown or partial lockdown in our 9 European countries. Is that 9? However many countries it is, anyway, in the European countries that we're looking at. And that's kind of nice because it means that lockdown date and calendar date are not the same thing across countries. So lockdown +1 is not the same. It's not the same date in Germany as it is in Portugal or the UK, or something like that. So that's kind of nice. That helps with our identification. And we're going to compare pre-lockdown to post-lockdown, where the split between the two is defined by these effective lockdown dates. Okay, I hope that's clear. For those of you who like equations, and I know a lot of us do, this is a absolutely bog standard difference in difference analysis, where we have T is the treatment, that's post the lockdown date, in 2020 or 2019. There's its main effect there. We have year dummies that are included in this mu, where we control for year and week and day fixed effects. And then this is the guy that interests us, whether treatment, that's post-lockdown day in 2020, was different. And that's what we're going to look at. As I will mention very briefly later, we do want to distinguish the well-being effects of the policy from the well-being effect of the illness that led to that policy. In that sense, mortality and infection are confounders here, and we don't want to assign the well-being effect of lockdown to the well-being effect of a higher infection rate. So we're going to control for the lagged number of new deaths by this variable xi-1 in the country or in the state if we're in the US. Okay. So the first thing we can do here is just plot the daily data. And this is an example for 3 of the 13 measures we looked at: boredom, loneliness, and sadness. The red line is the evolution in 2020. the red horizontal line that is. The vertical red line is the date of lockdown, which of course differs from one country to another, from one state to another. And the grey horizontal lines are the same series in 2019, which is of course pre-COVID. And there's something of a trend. There's something of a trend that you can see here, that loneliness does tend to drop off as spring comes, for example, and so does sadness. So it's important to compare the gap here, actually, so that we're not just assigning the effect of spring to reflecting lockdown. Now that's the intuition behind the use of a difference in difference here. And so that's what we're going to estimate, is the pre-post gap, red to grey, into before lockdown and post lockdown. That's what we're going to estimate. Okay. One thing that is quite interesting to note is that boredom started to rise in the US here even pre-lockdown. And it's worth bearing in mind that the US was a later lockdown country rather than an early lockdown country, so there could be some anticipation here, or also the effects of some kind of partial lockdowns in affecting schools or entertainment venues pre the official lockdown. Okay, that was the graphical analysis. If we run that actual difference in difference regression, this is our estimate of the effect of lockdown on subjective well-being in our Western European countries. And we have 13 measures here, and I think, I keep on getting this wrong, I think that 10 out of 13 of them are significant. Is that right? No, 9 out of 13 are significant. And these mostly go in the way that you would expect. Boredom increased, loneliness increased, sleep got, actually sleep went down, stress went down, sorry. Worry went up, and well-being went down. The size here is to be read in terms of this 0 to 100 scale. So remember, 100 is the top scoring day. What we're doing here is comparing the average pre-lockdown to the average post-lockdown on this 0 to 100 scale, relative to the same gap a year before, of course. So this figure here for boredom, well, I'm showing you the wrong one. This figure here for boredom is about 35, I think. So one way to understand that figure is that boredom searches pre-lockdown were at about, say, for example, 40% of the maximum figure recorded. Boredom searches after lockdown were on average 75% of that maximum figure. And that's a pretty big jump, and I'll try to quantify that in just a second. The patterns for the US and for Europe are remarkably similar, really remarkably similar. The one that is opposite, the only one that's the opposite way around, is well-being, which went down in Europe and went up in the US. Now, you might wonder why that is. And as I said earlier, the US is a late lockdown country. And if we split Europe into early and late lockdown countries, and the late lockdown countries are Ireland, Portugal, and the UK, we also find a positive well-being effect in Europe for the later lockdown countries. And it might be that you learn from the experience of others here. Um, when France locked down, sort of had a period of existential dread because it had no idea what's going on. But if you've seen other countries and how they deal with it and how you can manage to get food and to go to the chemist and this kind of thing, it may be that worry, that fear, whatever, is small, is less, and overall, the perceived public health benefits trump trump any kind of stress or whatever, or anticipation of what is to come, because you've seen it working in other countries. Of course, we can't prove that, but in general, we find early lockdown was tough, later lockdown was less tough across the countries we're looking at here. Now, I said these go mostly in the direction you might have thought. One that you might be surprised about, or actually two you might be surprised about, is the significant dropping off of searches for suicide and searches for divorce in both the US and the UK. Now, this is not something that's new in the literature. The immediate effect of lockdown was presumably to focus on very day-to-day and sort of hour-to-hour problems of running out of flour and toilet paper and things like this, and rather to push onto the back burner these very big objective decisions of am I going to quit my husband, or is my life worth living? It's sort of refocusing on not really mundane things, but refocusing on other aspects of your life than these big decisions. And let's just remember, if I can do this, that we are following people in lockdown for, on average, sort of 3 weeks. The average entry date is about March the 20th, perhaps here, and we're following them to April the 10th. So we've got about 20 days of data on people, and this is not a paper about what happens to people's well-being 1 year after repeated lockdown. It's really what happened in the first few weeks in this very unexpected situation. And that, well, that's the way I explained that to myself anyway. Of course, this is interpretation. I can't prove that to you. Right, we said that. That's the early, late lockdowns. So how big are these effects? I mean, these are they're searches in Google. They're not self-reports of subjective well-being or diagnostic measures, but we can think how much these things are moving around in terms of standard deviations, which allows us to think about, you know, sizes of movement. The boredom effect is huge. It really is the big one. Actually, the placeholder title when we started working on this, and this is Abel Brodeur's idea, was "America is Bored," but we we decided to switch to something a little more neutral afterwards. The boredom effect is a really big one. It's 2 standard deviations in Europe, smaller but still substantial in the US, and some of the other coefficients around half a standard deviation. So to put these into context, or put this into perspective, what do we know about subjective well-being movements, questionnaire well-being movements following major events? Well, 9/11 was around a quarter to a half of a standard deviation in the US, and around 10% of a standard deviation in the UK. And the Boston bombing, the immediate effect of the Boston bombing was around 1/3 of net affect. That's positive feelings minus negative feelings. It reduced net effect by about 1/3 of a standard deviation. That was using American time use survey data, by the way, the Boston bombing paper, and just randomly that 80 US survey was in the field when the Boston bombing happened. And some people were interviewed before, some people were interviewed just afterwards, and that's how we were able to get a sort of fine-grained analysis of day-to-day movements in well-being. Okay, so what have we? Oh no, that's not what I want to do. I wanted to do this first. Adaptation to lockdown. These are event study analyses. Again, because we've got higher frequency data, we can ask what's happening from day to day to day, and to make it a little easier to see, we can say what's happening week to week to week after lockdown. And for most countries, we only have 3 or 4 weeks after the lockdown. What is happening? Is there adaptation? Is it bad and you bounce back? There's not overwhelming evidence that people got used to lockdown very quickly. Boredom, if anything, is on an upward trend. There's some bouncing back in Europe in terms of loneliness, and I'm not shown it here. There's some bouncing back in terms of sleep and stress, but overall well-being, the 13th search term, actually is on a downward trend. So it's not something that we get used to, which we could presumably impose without end. You know, at some point we're going to have to stop it, because it just gets too overwhelming in terms of well-being. So there may be a limit to how long lockdown can last, just in mental health terms. And I'd like to say that maybe our policy has taken that into account, and that's why we keep on having a lockdown and taking it away and putting it back. But I don't think that's quite it. All right, so we've seen two things so far: the difference in difference, that's before to after. We've seen the event study graphs, and those show adaptation or not around the time of the event. The last thing I wanted to show you was a regression discontinuity, because some people use these things. And again, we've got fine-grained daily data, so we can look at the trend before lockdown compared to the trend after lockdown and see if there's a structural break the day that the lockdown was introduced. We can do that in 2020. We can do the same thing in 2019, and then we can compare those two structural breaks, and this is called a RDD, difference in difference estimation. And just to give you an example of how this works, this is the estimated time function of boredom pre-lockdown, estimated with a cubic function here. And then this is the estimated cubic function post-lockdown in Western Europe. And the structural break is this gap here. If these two lines sort of fit each other, then there's no break. If they don't fit each other, then there's a gap. And we're going to compare this gap to the gap produced by exactly the same method in 2019. You can see this. There's actually not much evidence at all of a particular gap in this placebo lockdown placebo lockdown date in 2019. And you can calculate this parameter in a regression controlling, not in just the raw data. We control for country fixed effects and the same fixed effects I told you about beforehand, and lag death as a confounder. We get a figure of 32 in Western Europe, which is actually pretty damn similar to what we got here, actually. There's the plus 30 something, plus 30 something, plus 35 maybe, and then the RDD gives us RDD diff and diff gives us a figure that's very much the same order of magnitude. And the point being here is these are just large effects on some aspects of subjective well-being that don't look as though they're particularly going away. And these mental health effects should enter into the cost benefit calculation when we think about pandemic policy. Should we impose restrictions or not? We do find that later lockdowns were less harmful, but again, this is just not generalizable, I don't think. We're looking at the 3-4 weeks following the first lockdown. I don't know if we can say anything about, use those results to say how people would react at the end of the third lockdown and when they're anticipating the fourth. I just don't know. But we could find out very quickly, because somebody could presumably just do the same submission that we did to Google Trends and just plot out what's been happening in Western Europe and the US. I mean, it's messy. It's messy because you could be recovering from the first lockdown and anticipating the second lockdown at the same time. So it's not so clean as the analysis when we just had one broadly unanticipated lockdown the first time around. Okay, what else did I want to say? I'm almost at the end. I did mention this briefly beforehand. We do need to separate the effect of the treatment, that's lockdown, from that of the illness, which is the pandemic. And the pandemic affects well-being and affects lockdowns. The worse is the pandemic, the more likely is a lockdown. So it's a confounder in our analysis. We have control for the daily new death rate. Maybe that wasn't quite the right measure to use. Maybe it should have been a weekly average. It should have been a change in how the daily new death rate has been changing. Is it going up or down? I don't know. This is what we used. It's an open question as to whether another infection or death measure would have done better. Now, I've been talking about sentiment data and saying that it's a useful addition to the analysis of well-being, simply because there's so much of it, and because it's real time. It's collected every day. But of course, it has drawbacks. and one of them is not representative. I mean, I know I started this talk by saying that response rates to these big surveys have been going down. But of course, there's no such thing as a response rate to a Google search. But not everyone uses Google. Not everyone uses the internet, and some people Google much more than others. So we're not measuring average sentiment in a country here. We're measuring the average sentiment of each Google search item. That's what we're doing, and we do have to bear in mind that that's potentially biased. It's not going to reveal the real sentiment figures. Although home internet is almost it's almost universal coverage of home internet in Europe. And I know some people have talked about analyzing Twitter and emojis in Twitter and everything. But I don't have Twitter. I don't know if you do. I'm sure you do. You're all sort of young, savvy people. But a paper that I looked at very recently about Twitter, what do you call them? Réseau, networks, Twitter networks amongst economists, and economists are, of course, incredibly social kinds of people. Only under 3% of people listed on RepEc, if you know what that is. It's a repertory of economists. Could be linked to a Twitter account, and some people tweet much more than others. So you would have a really kind of brutal selection effect if you were to carry out sentiment analysis on tweets. Not uninteresting, but almost certainly not representative. Something that might be a little more representative, though I've yet to see this used in a large scale way, is GATE. Where are we? GATE, there we are. Oops, no, that's not what we want to do. There we are, GATE here. GATE is the way you hold yourself. If you're straight or slouched, the way you hold your hands, whether you look down or you look up. And this has been shown to reflect your sort of psychological health, the positive or negative nature of your emotions. And it's quite easy to imagine with AI that you would be able to scan people in crowds. You know, it sounds a bit like the Matrix, but do this at a train station or whatever, or on a high street, and just get some gauge of the level of emotion by how people are walking and how they're holding themselves. I mean, this doesn't provide us with demographic information, so that's a bit rubbish. We've been looking. Google Trends doesn't provide us with demographic information, so we only know the average sentiment of the searches. We can't say anything about demographics: men, women, old, young, single, married, whatever. We don't know anything about that, and it might be useful to complement this kind of analysis with actually going back, back to the past, with going back to experience sampling methods as introduced by Csikszentmihalyi, and but in a sort of nice modern way on your smartphone, where you're randomly beeped and asked where you are, what you're doing, who you're with, and how do you feel about it. And this is the idea behind the Mappiness application that George McCarran at Sussex has been promoting as a sort of real-time measure of people. And we know who the people are as well. So we know their income category, their age, their sex, their education, things like this. So that's quite promising. And a last word, perhaps we shouldn't be ready quite yet to write off surveys. We've been with my colleagues, some of my co-authors at the University of Luxembourg, running a survey called Come Here, that's run by Qualtrics, not out of the goodness of their heart. We pay them to do it, of course. That covers representative samples in 5 European countries. And of course, you can run this as many times as you want, as many times as your budget will permit. And it's a panel. It's a panel. It's the same people interviewed every time, bar attrition. And attrition is not quite as bad as it might be because respondents are paid. And I suppose that's one way to get them to answer questionnaires. So we have 4 waves of Come Here data in April through late November 2020. 4 more waves are planned in 2021. Indeed, I think wave 5 is in the field at the moment. And that will allow us, or it does allow us, to relate individual well-being, and this is life satisfaction we're going to look at in this last graph, relate individual life satisfaction, in the last table rather, to various policy measures. And the 2 that I'm showing you here are stringency and the economic support index, both of which come from the government response tracker at the Blavatnik School in Oxford. And we can map those values that you see here on these graphs. We can map these to individual subjective well-being. And if we do that in a regression analysis, about 20,000 people, with and without individual fixed effects and controls and so on, we can see that stringency reduces well-being in their sample. So again, lockdowns are not good for subjective well-being. And Charlotte, I know I've almost finished. And and perhaps surprisingly, no significant correlation with the economic support index, though I suppose we should bear in mind that economic support is provided when things are already going badly. And if we think of furlough is synonymous with a fall in income. Okay, I'm finished. I hope I didn't go on for too much longer than I was meant to, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. This is a very interesting talk. I can see from the conversation. We have a lot of questions. Okay. Obviously, people are interested in this study and in this data. So I'd say we take questions now. And when you ask questions, if you can mention your name and your affiliation, that would be great. So we'll take the first question from Rachel Solovishik. Rachel, if you can unmute and ask questions.
Hi, thank you so much for having such an interesting talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is just a little picky thing. You gave Easter as an example of seasonality, but Easter moves and weather's random. Would it be better just to control for weather and Easter directly?
Okay. We control, no, I was saying that as a sort of off the cuff thing. We control for day of the week effects, week of the month effects, and month of the year and year. So that picks up whatever systematic relation there is, though we could actually have an Easter dummy. Yeah. No, I mean, we could put in weather. Of course, some of these countries are quite big, and it always rains in Manchester, but Brighton is always sunny, as we know. But we could absolutely match in weather, sure. No, that's a fair point.
And the other thing, which I think is a more philosophical thing is you're testing the effect of a formal government lockdown. But
Yeah.
early on, the formal government lockdowns didn't have all that much effect on mobility because people sort of thought staying home was a good idea. So if you sort of did it as an intent to treat, you basically take your numbers and blow them up by 10 because the difference in mobility between a formal lockdown and an informal lockdown is pretty small.
We did compare partial to full lockdowns. I didn't show you this because I didn't want to run out of time. We did not find much particular difference between the two. Not,
Maybe,
I
I
mean,
guess
I mean, your point is a very good one, but thank God it works in my favor. In the sense that what we're calling lockdowns might have only been a bit partial.
yeah. I mean, I
But
worked.
that means, sorry, that just means we're underestimating
Yeah,
the,
that's what I
the
mean.
and these are already gigantic. I mean,
I
some of
know.
them are really, really large. I mean, the takeaway is just that there was a big mental health cost of the first lockdown, and we need to bear that in mind when we're deciding, when making future policy choices.
Yeah, I do think you're underestimating, and it may be future lockdowns will have a higher mental health cost because they actually change behavior more.
Could be.
Because
Yeah, could be, and could be that the first one you accepted it, and it's sort of you know, we're all standing together for the good of the country and so on. But by lockdown number 3, you've just lost that sense of solidarity. Who knows? I mean, we don't know because we only went 3 or 4 weeks after the first lockdown was introduced. But certainly this analysis could be done again. There's no difficulty in doing that to try to see how well-being developed. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and next we'll take question from Sam Oxuzel.
Ah,
Yeah. Hello, Andrew.
hi, Tim.
Thanks. Hey, how are you? Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. One thing I'm trying to get my head around is that during this period, there was a jump in like almost every keyword search that you can think of. Because we're at the OECD, we're involved in a couple of projects, and we find similar jumps in everything,
Okay.
whether it's about labor-related, education, I mean, anything. So how can we think of these magnitudes and isolate, or at least demean or something, the effects, the jump that we are seeing because of people are staying home, so they're doing
Yeah,
more
sure.
internet searches. How can we do that? Thank you.
Well, we already did. These are all relative to the day with the highest number of searches for that term in that geographical area in that time period. So whatever your top, divorce search date was, that's 100 in France, and all the other figures are relative to that 100. So they're totally comparable in that sense. They're totally comparable in that sense. I'm just trying to, you see, it's not true what you just said, because not all of our terms were searched more frequently. Some of them were searched less frequently. So I'm not sure there's an obvious bias in what we're saying. If everything had been plus 20, then you think, oh yeah, well that's just because people are on they're at home on their computers for 8 hours every day, and they're meant to be working, and instead they're faffing around, looking for cake recipes or something. That wasn't the general our general finding. Some things went up, other things went down. So well-being went down, for example, as a search term. So that's sort of something to know. I mean, my feeling is it's normalized. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if I understand correctly, normally the method, the way this thing works is that you normalize it within the keyword. So you have 100, which is the highest level for that given keyword within the time period that you're covering. So that is 2019 to 2020. So it's relative. It's like a within change. But I'm wondering how we can, maybe demean it by the overall search intensity in overall Google during that period. You see, but anyway, we can talk about it.
I mean, that would. Oh, I don't mind doing that, but that would be. I mean, that would not. I don't see how that can change the significance actually, because it's a normalization. But I understand the broad point you're making. I've noted it down. That you may need to renormalize. I don't think so, but let me take that on board. Thanks.
Thank you.
The next question, Michael Joffe.
My question's already been dealt with by the first questioner, so I'll pass on that. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. That's the kind of question I like. Thanks.
And Tara Alas.
Hi, Tara Alice from McKinsey.
Hi.
Thank you so much for a fabulously interesting presentation. I wanted to get your perspective on the degree to which, the government's focus on lives and livelihoods. So basically keeping people alive and then giving them some money and some jobs is perhaps missing out on this aspect of life satisfaction. And whether, in your estimation, your study sort of supports the data that ONS has also been publishing on well-being, which shows just a huge drop from pre and post, and continuing to be at a kind of 6.5 instead of a 7.5 pre-lockdown. And so thoughts on that would be interesting.
Well, my overall feeling is, I've cheated a little bit in this presentation. I think life satisfaction or something of that ilk is the ultimate goal. But we can't really look, it doesn't in some sense make sense to look at life satisfaction as a search term. So we looked at some components of mental health. But the idea, the overriding idea is that mental health and income and employment and mortality and health, these all enter into some overall function that produces what it is that we should care about as a society, which is subjective social welfare as experienced by the people who are living those lives. So, lives and livelihoods. There's actually something philosophically quite difficult about this, in that the people who die don't answer questionnaire. They don't answer questionnaires. So we have to sort of make a hypothetical calculation of how happy those people would have been were they not dead. But that's in some sense, I don't want to say it's a minor point, but it's 100,000 people out of 68 million. Certainly, health is enormously important in life satisfaction, as we know, and so is employment. Income arguably less so. So it was a right focus. It just wasn't broad enough. And the insistence on the average, on the mean, didn't really take into account this kind of fatigue. People call it behavioral fatigue, of the duration of lockdown that we saw in some of our data with respect to for example, stress.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a bit echoey. I couldn't quite hear that.
Just say thank you very much. That's very
okay.
interesting.
Okay. Thanks.
And we have a question from Matt Eddles. Matt, if you can unmute yourself.
I think he can unmute himself, moment.
Oh, go on.
Okay, I'll just read his questions.
Okay.
So he mentioned you didn't include anxiety among others in the Google search. So
did we not? How awful of us. Did we not? That's really kind of poor. I mean, if damn, we didn't, did we? No, I mean, anxiety. We had panic, stress, and worry. Anxiety could have been another concept. To be frank with you, I genuinely don't know why we didn't have anxiety in there. Is anxiety part of GHQ? No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is, but that's not a reason not to have it. No, I hold my hands up. Pre-analysis plan wasn't in there, so we couldn't put it in afterwards, and we didn't do it. I mean, of course, it's easy enough to do. You can do it now and see whether anxiety has some kind of different trend to these other components. I mean, there is actually a question of how distinct some of these are from each other. Obviously, suicide is different from divorce, but you might think of these panic, stress, worry, whatever, irritability. You might think of these as being part of some underlying general construct, which is psychological well-being, and that's the idea behind the GHQ. So we might not have gained much from adding anxiety, but of course we don't know because we didn't have it in there. Thanks.
Yeah, and next from Annalika.
Yes, hi, Angelika Bardalai here. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is actually somewhat related to the last question because it's about the groupings and the concepts. Yeah. I wanted to ask, how confident are you about the grouping of the search terms into the 13 categories? Because it seems like a pretty fundamental aspect of the research. So I just wondered, are you able to provide any further information on the actual sentiment analysis of the search terms?
Oh, that's an easy question. The answer is no. When you say the grouping, is that with the picture where we said things like social dysfunction and anxiety and happiness? Is that what you mean, or was it why did we choose those 13 terms to start with?
Yeah, it was more the choice of the 13 terms, the sort of categories, if you like, and then the way in which, because obviously, if you're doing Google Trends and it's based on searches, people don't enter boredom as a Google search term. They're entering, whatever search query it is, and then it gets grouped and allocated, if you like, into one of the categories. So the question was more around that process. And how
no, these aren't search terms. These we didn't use search terms. These are topic queries.
Okay.
So boredom, and I don't know the algorithm. Boredom is associated with any number of concepts, any number of words. Sorry, any number of words that might be construed as linked to boredom, and that's the idea of the topic query, and it does that in any language in any country as well. Actually, it's quite clever. So if you search in English in France like I do, then that will be part of the French sentiment. So no, they're not sort of exact words, and because we put in irritability and not irritation, we'd be missing something. They're groupings of sentiment as determined by Google.
Okay, so basically Google does that analysis and then you take that as given.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, that's the idea of a topic query search. It's whatever Google thinks is sort of related to that thing you're interested in. I'm sure somebody knows much more about how they do that than I do.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And we have another question from Joe Grease.
Oh, or do we?
Joe, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
That worked?
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting stuff there and lots of interesting findings. But one thing that stuck at the back of my mind in terms of the public policy response, we know from your work and indeed from what ONS has done in the UK that clearly well-being has been very badly impacted by lockdown. People are clearly very bored, probably more bored as time goes on, anxious and so on. But at the same time, all the stuff that Ipsos Mori and YouGov and various other opinion groups do shows that most people still think by a very large margin that the government, if anything, is being too cavalier in relaxing restrictions rather than the reverse. So isn't the implication that people are sort of saying to us, yeah, we know we're bored, yes, we know we're fed up, yes, we know our well-being is very significantly impacted, but for goodness sake, don't relax the restrictions at all precipitately. And isn't there a sort of, don't you have to sort of consider the two sets of evidence together in terms of working out what the appropriate cost-benefit analysis is?
No, you do. I think there are a couple of things here. You're talking about well-being now after we've had 3 lockdowns, and that's sort of hindsight that the first one was probably may have been released too early. Maybe that's true. The second thing is that we really need to split out the effect of the policy response from the circumstances that required that policy in the first place. So I'm not surprised, as one of the previous participants said, that life satisfaction has fallen off a cliff. The question is, how far would it have fallen were we not to have had the policies we had? And of course it would have gone down. I mean, nobody's suggesting that policy will be able to maintain life satisfaction faced with such huge economic cost and health costs and all kinds of disruptions, social life and things like this. But I don't know whether we can directly read that just by looking at average well-being scores. Rather, we want to try to disentangle the two. Another question, the question as to whether the government was too cavalier. I'm not sure I want to get involved in that one. We're looking at a number of different European countries, of course, with all the different colours and hues of policy making. I mean, it's very easy to be wise after the event, isn't it? I mean, what's your feeling? Were people fed up at the end of the first lockdown, or did they think that it should carry on? And of course, the question is, did they think it should carry on, or they thought it should be stopped, knowing that we would then have to have another one? It's not easy to back out the right sentiment here, I don't think. I mean, there's sentiment about how competent the government is or was. that's not a very good answer, because I don't think I'm very clear about whether we should have opened up when we did open up. We did with Richard Layard and Daisy Fancourt and Gus O'Connell and others. We did try to put in some numbers to a social welfare function that was calibrated using life satisfaction scores, and predict the profile of income loss, health, loneliness, commuting, trust. And we got something like the lockdown should have been lifted, if I remember now, it's something in August or early September. But whether that was the right calculation, I don't know. And that's what we got anyway. Sorry, that wasn't an incredibly clean answer. I just don't think I have one.
Okay. We have a few more questions, but for the interest of time, I think we have to end this webinar because we are already over time. Thank you again, Andrew, for this wonderful piece of research.
It's my pleasure. If anyone has a question that they didn't get to ask, I mean, just send an email. That would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so the next ESCoE webinar will be on the 11th of March. We will have Thies Lindenthal from the University of Cambridge. He will talk about accountability in machine learning applications. So we welcome everyone to participate if you have an interest. So yeah, thank you for participating, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody.